So you can start right now.
Okay, then I start. And I see participants are entering our room here. Perfect. Yeah, I welcome everyone. The speakers who are already together with us and the increasing number of online participants. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our workshop number 4 on changes in health research during and after the COVID-19 era. It's a great pleasure, especially because we have a wonderful list of speakers, all internationally leading experts that will present on several topics that are very relevant for this overarching scheme of our workshop. I will present and briefly introduce the speakers before they start. My name is Daniel Strech. I am professor for bioethics and meta research here in Berlin at the Berlin Institute of Health and the Charité. And I'm the chair of this session together with my colleague Ulrich Dürnagel, who will later moderate our discussion. With regard to the storyboard, my slides are coming now. We have a 90-minute workshop, and I will start with a very brief introduction with regard to the rationale of our background. Why did we choose this topic, this overarching theme? We'll then have our speakers to present on some of the relevant topics, give you more in-depth information. At this point, I already have to say that unfortunately, one of our speakers, we initially planned with 4 speakers, Ben Goldegger, had to cancel his presentation on short notice. Ben Goldegger from Oxford University wanted to present on the Open Safely platform as one example of changes with regard to our opportunities for accessing electronic health records for secondary use and research purposes. So we'll not have this presentation here today. This gives the other 3 speakers a little bit more time for their presentations. And if this will all work out, we will keep track of the timing, of course. We will then have a final discussion of 20 minutes, where we can also discuss the overarching topic of this conference workshop, but also come back to some of these topics. And for the online participants, you can, of course, during all the time in the chat, ask questions. At each presentation, where we have a 15-minute presentation, we have also 5 minutes for questions and answers. So either your questions are already maybe directly answered by some of the speakers or by the workshop chairs, or we can then address them in the 5-minute Q&A, and overarching questions are primarily addressed then in the final discussion. With regard to the background, so why did we choose this title, Changes in Health Research During and After the COVID-19 Era? I assume that all participants here have a clear picture about the fact that health research already was and still is an extremely complex endeavor, from designing research over conducting it, analyzing data, the dissemination of results in different ways. So all this is an extremely complex cycle, but extremely important, because this reduces, if possible, our uncertainty in decision making. And because it's such a complex, but also such an important topic, we have different measures at place and still work on measures on how we can improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of how we do health research. So some of these measures, and this is not a comprehensive list, some of these measures are topics that we address today in our workshop. So measures that give us access to health data, data from electronic health records, for example, to make them available for secondary use, especially important in a pandemic situation, but also many other situations. We need an ethics review prior to conducting clinical trials and clinical studies with humans to uphold the trustworthiness of the research, the responsibility. We need different ways for how people collaborate to make this complex endeavor as effective and efficient as possible. And on the more dissemination side, of course, you can try to be timely in the results reporting by using preprints. You increase the value of your research, the value of the knowledge gain, if your final results are openly accessible and not, for a good part of the world, hidden behind a paywall. This is open access, and of course also scientific publications, including preprints, do not report all data or research data, but among colleagues it can be very helpful and be effective and very efficient for health research if we share data, more detailed data. So all of these are topics, and there are more that have been discussed over years, some of them over a decade. Things improved over the past years, but there's of course in many of these areas a broad and also controversial debate on whether we are really as good as we could be, and whether we maybe see a lot of rationales for why we could be even more effective and efficient with regard to these topics. Now, during COVID-19, we saw a very interesting and strong increase in many of these areas. So for access to electronic health records, for example, we see in Great Britain a new database, Open Safely, which is a secure analytics database, which is organized by Ben Goldacre, Oxford University. But as I already said at the beginning, unfortunately, Ben Goldacre cannot present this today. But this is something that gives access to millions of healthcare data from NHS patients, something we haven't seen before, and something that maybe was not possible before. I know that many other countries are working on something like this. With regard to ethics review, the World Health Organization, the WHO, made recommendations on how to keep ethics review also in pandemic situations in a way that is as effective and as efficient as possible. We will have Andreas Reis presenting on this later. With regard to collaboration, of course, collaboration exists and existed over years already, but we see new activities during COVID-19 on a local, national, and international level that really outpace what we saw before. In Germany, for example, we have a new network of all university medical centers funded by the German Ministry of Education and Research with more than 150 million, or 150 million, not much more. But this now facilitates different kinds of networking in a way that we did not see before. Christopher Baum will also briefly say something about this network later on. Then with regard to preprint servers, of course, we have preprint servers since some times, but with COVID-19, preprint servers were used in a way that we didn't see before. And Theodora Blum will later report on changes in this regard and challenges maybe also that come with this. For open access, I think at the very beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, many relevant important stakeholders, such as the Wellcome Trust, the very initial state, but also many other funders and journals all committed themselves to make all COVID-19 research results openly accessible. And this is, as best as I know, also happening. At least during the COVID-19 era, these results are openly accessible. And we see many sharing activities and ways on how to facilitate data sharing, especially for COVID-19. So this is something that really increased these activities to make research more effective and more efficient. And our interest here in the workshop is to better understand what is currently going on. This is what the speakers will present on several of these aspects. But we also have this overarching question. What about health research after COVID-19, or maybe even better, health research during the area of tuberculosis and malaria and many other diseases. We know that now, since almost 1 year of COVID-19, we saw more than 1 million deaths due to COVID-19, which is dramatic and very sad. But we also see since years 2 million people dying every year due to tuberculosis and malaria. Many deaths because of cancer. We have diseases such as Alzheimer, where we do not have any treatment options now. And therefore the question is, what of the positive developments that occurred during the COVID-19 era for improving effectiveness and efficiency in research? What of these positive developments should we and can we maintain also after the COVID-19 era? This is our overarching topic that we will primarily discuss in the final discussion. So this was my intro. And I now hand over to our first speaker, Andreas Reis. He is co-lead of the WHO unit for health, ethics and governance. And he will present on current changes and recommendations in this regard with regard to an ethics review in times of a pandemic such as COVID-19. Thank you very much, Andreas, for joining us today and for your input. So I close my presentation.
Yes, can you see the slides?
Yeah, perfect.
Good, thank you very much for this kind introduction, Daniel, and for the invitation to you and also to the organizers of the World Health Summit. I'm very pleased that the topic of ethics gets highlighted during this workshop, which I think addresses a very timely and important topic. Just to say that ethics has been at the heart of WHO's response to COVID-19 since the beginning. Already in February of this year, WHO established an international expert group of about 20 people on ethics and COVID-19. And since then, this working group has addressed many of the key ethical issues that arise not only in research on COVID-19, but also in the response to this pandemic. So issues such as resource allocation or digital contact tracing, human challenge studies, and key tenets of research ethics have been really at the center of the work of this expert group and several groups that we have established. One of the key issues that always arise is, of course, ethics review to address the pandemic such as COVID-19, and I will focus my talk today on rapid ethics review. Here's a quick overview what I will talk about. One is the rapid ethics review prior to COVID-19. Of course, this is not the first pandemic that we're dealing with. Then, as Daniel said, I will speak in detail about WHO's guidance for research ethics committees. And finally, I will talk a bit about the implementation at country level. So, as I said, we have been working on ethics and pandemics at WHO at least from 2001, 2002, all the way back to SARS, Ebola, and then Zika, and then Lassa fever, and so forth. And this has meant that we have actually been able to draw some lessons from these previous outbreaks. And one of the key lessons is really the need for rapid turnaround of ethics review of research proposals. One of the important things that we have found is that public health emergencies often, in a way, magnify ethical issues that already exist in health systems, but also in research. And one of the characteristics has been that often there are no treatments or vaccines for these often neglected diseases or new diseases, as is the case for COVID-19. But as you know, WHO has established an R&D blueprint to address many of these diseases of pandemic potential for which there's no treatment or vaccines. But it is really essential to carry out research during these circumstances where no treatment or vaccines exist. And what is also important is that research should be really an integral part of the response efforts. One of the problems is that countries have varying degrees of capacity for research and are often not really prepared to engage in research efforts. And the same is true for ethics review, and especially for ethics review that is in a way accelerated. This is why for a number of years we have been advocating that ethics should actually be an integral part of pandemic preparedness, and we call this concept the ethics preparedness, so that we can ensure that rapid research can be carried out and respecting the ethical standards and making sure that the research is sound ethically. Time is, of course, of essence. That's why sometimes researchers will say, we actually don't have time for ethics. You know, we need to carry out our research projects. There's no time to waste for ethics review. But from our standpoint, it's very important that the standard ethical principles of peacetime, in a way, still hold during emergencies. And it's extremely important to make that point that we cannot cut any corners, that we must uphold the internationally accepted principles, but have to accelerate the processes. In addition, after research is of course important to rapidly share the data from research, and we'll talk about this later, to not only benefit for the future, but hopefully to be able to shape the ongoing response efforts. We've had a number of workshops on rapid ethics review in the wake of the Ebola outbreak. One very important one was of about 13 national ethics committees in Senegal in 2018, just prior to the global summit of national ethics committees. This workshop came out with a number of recommendations. So the first one was that all countries should adopt special standard operating procedures for ethics review during emergencies. There should be a possibility of pre-reviewing, pre-submitting, and then pre-reviewing research protocols. Joint ethics review at a regional and multi-country level should be encouraged. There must be much more coordination between stakeholders, that is national research ethics committees or national ethics committees, regulatory and public health authorities. Data, sample, and benefit sharing needs to be facilitated, and in particular, there needs to be provisions on the ethical management of biological samples. So, for example, material transfer agreements. When COVID-19 came along, despite the recommendations, I would say, from this workshop, not many countries had actually taken up these recommendations. And again, there was a strong need to facilitate research as rapidly as we can. And this is why from the ethics side, one of the first guidance documents that was developed was on how to facilitate the rapid review of research during public health emergencies. Yeah, and so this WHO guidance document, which you can find online under this link, which is a bit small, but I hope it's clickable, and I hope the slides will all be shared. There are a couple of main points. So one is, when should these emergency SOPs, standard operating procedures, be actually triggered? There was quite some discussion on this. And this would be only on the declaration of an emergency by the country. The goal is, of course, to accelerate the beginning of studies. The process relies heavily on virtual meetings and processes. As we all know, everything is now virtual. And this is maybe one of the lessons also for the future. In this area as well, whether we actually still need all these face-to-face meetings for ethics review. An important point is the language considerations, because sometimes studies will actually not be available in local language, and this is quite important to do a meaningful ethics review in a country. And then there are about 20 recommendations to facilitate rapid review, as well as a checklist of different items and documents that would facilitate the fast tracking. And what's also important in terms of a process is that there is clear communication to all the different stakeholders about this sort of changed modality of ethics review to switch to a rapid review model. Just to name a few of the key recommendations. So it's important to identify a dedicated group of ethics committee members. This can be a subcommittee or a special COVID research ethics committee, for example. The members should be somewhat specialized in these types of projects or protocols. The quorum can be a bit lighter than usual, so of 1/3, for example. There can be flexible review arrangements and also shortened timeframes for each step. What's very important, and that we have also found from a WHO perspective, is the onus is often put on the ethics review committee, but actually the PIs also play a very important role, the principal investigators, because they can already prime the committee that something is coming, which will facilitate the organization of a committee meeting, for example, very much. And then, of course, the PIs also have a strong responsibility in getting back to the committee quickly in case of questions. So sometimes what we found is actually that the turnaround time of the ethics review is quite quick, but then you are waiting for several days for the PIs to provide answers. And then in the end, it does take a week or two to actually get approval, but the time the protocols were actually with the ethics review committee is shorter than with the technical team. A few other issues regarding the time frame. So we're suggesting that the protocols should be sent to the reviewers within 24 hours of submission. There should be only a few days for the reviewers to complete the reviews, but this should be specified in the SOPs. And the report or the approval should be communicated to the PI within a specified time. Sorry, could be 7 days or 5 days. And then, as I said originally, the PI should also respond promptly to the review. Many of the countries, since the publication of this guidance document, have adopted this. It's not entirely attributable. I think this is one of several documents and publications calling for specified emergency SOPs, but just a few countries that I want to highlight. So one is in India. The Indian Council of Medical Research has recently published national guidelines for ethics committees that review biomedical and health research during the pandemic, and also a specific SOP document that is accompanying this publication. In Ireland, a National Research Ethics Committee for COVID-related research has been established. So they have gone a separate way, and you can see here their standard operating procedures. And then in New Zealand, there's also specific emergency response SOPs for research with COVID. Nigeria has also done quite a lot of work. And in Latin America, there are many committees that are also operating with special SOPs. I can't go into details here, but just to say that from our experience, many countries have, in a way, been able to accelerate the ethics review for COVID-related research. And with this, I want to thank our Ethics and COVID expert group at WHO and also our consultant, Leanne Pascoe. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. My name is Ulrich Diernagel. I'm co-chairing this session, and I will try to moderate the questions. And that's just a reminder also to you, if you have questions during the talk or even now, you can just type it into the Q&A section down below at your screen, and I will direct it to the speakers. So we have had already some exchange, but it was already solved during the talk. But there is a question by Richard Hartlaub. It goes directly to our speaker, and the question is, Andreas, I'm reading it to you because the audience, I think, cannot see it. Andreas, extremely timely work, of course. Other than states, to what degree has this been picked up by other large research funders and integrated into their procedures?
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for this question, which is a very important and interesting one. I have to admit that I don't know really the answer. That would be a very good research project to see how funding bodies are dealing with this and have taken up the SOPs. I cannot say much more about this. We do at WHO host the Global Summit of National Ethics Committees. This is why we are very much in touch from the ethics unit side with all the national ethics committees, which are by now about 80. And that's why we have a very good picture on that. But I will happily take up this suggestion and try and find out more about this very important issue. Thank you for that comment or question.
Daniel has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas, for this very good overview. And I heard back from people in different countries, especially I have to say in this case from the United States, but also from Germany, that something occurred during ethics review procedures that was quite new. I'm not sure whether this not happened in other pandemics. That is something like the idea of prioritization across clinical studies. So some people highlighted the challenge that in some areas at least, there were more studies approved by ethics review boards than patients were available, so to say, right? So, and then the question popped up, and here in a current German project, but I know also from other projects, people are now dealing with this question: should ethics review boards in such a pandemic crisis, if they face a situation that they become aware that they approve more studies than are patients available, should the ethics review boards address this topic? Was this somehow discussed during the development of your guidance, or is this something that is maybe already known in pandemic situations, or relatively new topic?
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. This is not a completely new topic, although I think it has come more to the fore during COVID. During Ebola, certainly, there was already a discussion, at least among some of the practitioners, how much time should actually be dedicated to research in response, or should we even do research when so many people are dying and we don't have the capacity to actually treat all the patients correctly. And one ethicist colleague has once put it like this: you know, if you send a helicopter with 10 people to an earthquake situation, how many researchers should be on that helicopter as opposed to first responders? And I think that is a very interesting thought. So at WHO, we've always made the point that ethics should really be embedded into the public health response, and should really be part and parcel of the response. Now, if you have a situation where you cannot do all the research projects, either because the situation is overwhelming, you need to devote all the energy to a response, or you have too many research projects, I would agree that is a very interesting question. Who in that case then should make the prioritization? And of course, you can be of different opinions. What would be a top priority research project versus a lower priority research project? Would the social value for project be the sort of major factor, or others? And who should make that decision? I think that is very difficult. I'm not quite sure that the ethics committee could be the one, because they would not necessarily be the only ones, or wouldn't have the overview, let's say, of all the studies that are being done in a site.
Yeah, I think we have to go to the second speaker now, and I just took over this moderation only because I announced at the beginning I will introduce, of course, also the other speakers when they come. So we thank you, Andreas. We now hand over to our second speaker, Theodora Bloom. She is executive editor at the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, and she is also a co-founder of one of the most prominent servers for preprints, the Meta Archive. And so we asked Theodora whether she would present on, yes, the current changes in how we preprint the current research results for COVID-19, but also maybe with regard to challenges that already occurred or that she sees in this area. So thank you very much, Theodora, for joining and for presenting.
Thank you. Just sharing my screen. Hopefully you can see the correct image now. And thank you for inviting me to be here. I will talk about changes in publication practices. And sorry, I now have a frog in my throat. As Daniel said, I'm speaking from the perspective of both being a journal editor, where there are a medical journal editor seeing lots of challenges in the pandemic, but also having founded a preprint server and seeing how that has grown as well. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, when we talk about preprints, we mean papers that are ready for, the authors have finished with them and ready to submit them to a journal, but choose also to share at that time with a wider public by posting on a preprint server. And what the graph in the background shows you is that in red, physical scientists have been posting preprints for many decades. But in green, what you see is the growth in the biological sciences, which really took place in the last 5 years or so. And the case for sharing work via preprints is quite easy to make. It's about speeding up science, because if you have to wait to know what other groups have done until they are publishing their work in a journal, you may wait months after they've finished the work, but a preprint allows you to skip those months as a fellow researcher and to feed back on their work as well and maybe improve the final published articles. But when it comes to thinking about clinical practice, of course, there's always a worry that you might publish things that are wrong and that would prove harmful to the health of either individuals or populations. So when we launched a medRxiv, it's a partnership between Cold Spring Harbor Lab, who run bioRxiv in the basic sciences, BMJ, where we provide editorial expertise about assessing clinical research, and colleagues at Yale, who are academic researchers who are doing a lot of the outreach and community building around preprints. And it is a not-for-profit service. Nobody pays to post a preprint or to read one. It's managed in partnership by the 3 organizations, and currently now has some philanthropic funding from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And it was launched in the second half of 2019. We have some very basic submission requirements. On the left, essentially says we only take research articles. This isn't a place to share opinions, essays, narratives. It's about research and sharing research with fellow researchers. And on the right, basically that we follow basic medical journal editors' practice on how to produce clinical research, which includes asking for statements about funding, about ethical oversight, about registering studies if it's appropriate, for example, when they're clinical trials. And it turns out that between them, those 2 reasons are enough to see us turning away about 20% of what we receive. It's either not a research article or doesn't follow those basic tenets of having ethical oversight, for example. And when we receive articles, we go through a process of risk mitigation. We want to make sure that if we're sharing something as a preprint, it's because there is a benefit to doing that rather than waiting until peer review is complete. So we ask the author to make various undertakings which cover the sorts of things I showed you previously about whether it's research and has been appropriately conducted. But then we ask, does this appear to be a research article? Has it been plagiarized? And is there that health threat if it's shared? And that's done through a series of checks by Cold Spring Harbor staff, then affiliated researchers who look and say, yes, this appears to be an article in my field. And it can be escalated to, first of all, a very experienced clinician editor, or secondly, the medRxiv leadership, a group that includes me, to say, shall we post this or not, ultimately? And all of that takes about 2 days. And so some people say, oh, that looks an awful lot like peer review, but it really doesn't. I'll talk a bit more about peer review in a minute. And when things are posted on medRxiv, they have a lot of cautionary notes on the homepage of the server, on each article, on the FAQ guidance for journalists and others, to try to emphasize this is not health advice, this is not peer-reviewed research. This is just researchers sharing with each other in a way which we, the general public, can eavesdrop on. And when I looked a few days ago, we were just shy of 10,000 preprints on COVID-19 between medRxiv and bioRxiv. And that has grown very fast, of course. The first papers were only appearing in January and February from China. And so having launched this server in the second half of last year, we were seeing 9 or 10 articles a day submitted in December and January. That doubled in February, doubled again in March, doubled again in April, such that we really had sort of 3 months to scale up for 10-fold increase in submissions, which was pretty challenging. Things have now stabilized somewhat. But we have posted more than 12,000 articles overall, of which a large number are about COVID. A very significant number have been revised after their initial posting. And as I said, quite a number are rejected because they're not research or not appropriately reported, or very occasionally because of that worry about risks to health. The usage of medRxiv has also gone up very significantly in that period in January and February, when people were starting to be very desperate for information about the virus and the pandemic, and has continued at a high level. And the number of countries involved has of course changed. You'll be familiar with other graphs that look like this, you know, with a large peak from China initially. There's actually a sort of bump from Italy within this noise at the bottom. And of course, now the US becoming very prominent. So this is a global endeavor. We have postings from hundreds of countries, more than, I think, 130 so far. And as I say, free to use and free to read. And there's been a pretty widespread recognition of the value of preprints. They are indexed now widely, and prominent journals report on them. But there have also been worries about their misuse. You know, are the general public receiving information that is not helpful, that they may believe is more definitive than it is, and so on. And I want to give an example of why I think preprints are very useful, but it also makes some other points. So in the middle of June this year, the Chief Medical Officer in the UK wrote to all physicians working for the National Health Service and said, please start prescribing the drug dexamethasone to seriously ill patients with COVID. And he issued that statement on the basis of preliminary findings from the recovery trial, a very large-scale trial operating within the NHS. So that was on the 16th of June, I think. And it wasn't until the 22nd of June that a preprint was ready and posted, showing the data on which that decision had been made. But at least that was only a few days in which physicians were being asked to prescribe without seeing the data underlying it. And as you'll note from the preprint, that's now been published in the New England Journal, and it was published very quickly, only a month after submission. But that's still a month in which, if there hadn't been a preprint, physicians would not have known on what basis they were being asked to prescribe this drug and not able to assess the benefits. And if dexamethasone appears to reduce deaths by 1/3 for ventilated patients and 1/6 for those receiving oxygen, and there were tens of thousands, if not more, patients globally in those conditions, how long do you want to wait to use the relevant drug? Conversely, do you really want to be told by our leaders what drugs to prescribe on no visible evidence? And we've certainly seen where that has backfired also in COVID. So I want to switch gears for a moment and talk about journal publishing. And BMJ, the journal, the BMJ weekly in print, but also of course online, is part of a portfolio of about 70 journals, some wholly open access and some mixed models. And these all undergo, when they publish material, they do so following, you know, a stringent peer review process that involves multiple academics reading papers in great detail. It includes specialist statisticians, it includes patient reviewers, often, nearly always includes revising an article before it's final. And that whole publication process can be speeded up to be only a couple of months, but it's still likely to be, you know, 6 weeks or so usually. And we've seen huge growth at journals too. At the BMJ and sibling journals, we've had an 85% increase in submissions this year. We've increased by 14% how much we've put out. We've also got slightly faster, trying to improve the turnaround times of articles. And like other publishers, we are making all our COVID-related information freely available, whether that is original research or guidance for physicians on how to practice, or any other material that we publish. And so we have this situation where we are doing more work faster and giving away the results. And I should say that we, the reviewers, the authors, the editors, are doing this work in unusual circumstances, where we're often having to juggle childcare and work in the same space. And maybe that underlines a point that we've observed and others have reported on too about gender non-equality, that we see that the numbers of female first authors on research published this year is much lower than on research published the previous year. Certainly when it comes to experts who are asked to write editorials and to comment, we as others have observed that they are far more male than female. And I think Andrea said, you know, outbreaks and pandemics tend to exacerbate problems with the ethics process. I think they do with the publication process too. We've seen that. This is one example. Now, because Ben is not here to talk to us about changing the way we do research, I just wanted to throw in a little bit more about the way research is being done and how that's changing. So the recovery trial is one which aims to recruit essentially every patient with COVID-19 in the UK, and only to give them experimental treatments within the context of that trial, so that the results of doing so are useful. And that contrasts quite a lot with what we've seen in some of the other countries where, for example, hydroxychloroquine became very popular and people prescribed it very widely in several countries. There was no evidence that it worked well. And in fact, now we have evidence that it probably did more harm than good. But if you're not testing at the time you're using experimental treatments, you're really missing an opportunity. But in addition to the actual clinical trials, how do we turn research results into reliable evidence and clinical guidelines? And so we've been working with the MAGIC group based in Scandinavia and Canada on a process called rapid recommendations. We've been doing those for a couple of years, but we've obviously ramped them up with COVID. Those have the aim of disseminating clinical guidance about a research result within 90 days of the research result appearing. And that used to appear very fast. It now, of course, in pandemic days, that doesn't seem as fast as it used to. We're also producing living systematic reviews. So when these rapid recommendations and others do a systematic review, it will be published, but we will undertake to update it periodically. An example on the left is one that we've done jointly with WHO on guidelines of treatment for COVID-19. I want to make a couple of thoughts in closing. One is about funders who have mandated the use of preprints. An example is welcome, but there are many others. And they've said that in a health emergency, you have to post a preprint ahead of publication if you're funded by those funders. And that's all very well and good and has seen a huge increase in preprints in this outbreak. But it seems to me that they are almost saying that there is no emergency about research on cancer, Parkinson's, malaria, all those other conditions. In those cases, researchers can wait some weeks and months to read each other's results. And that, I suspect, is not a message they really can stand by. Second point is about sustainability and business models. And as I said, preprint servers, free to use, free to read. And we currently have one funder choosing to fund a couple of preprint servers. We have journals giving away all COVID-related content. Usually these are without open access fees because they're education material, news, updates, and so on. We've seen huge increases in the workloads of editors, reviewers, as everyone is focusing on this same problem with great urgency. But how should that be paid for? And I think article processing charges probably aren't the answer because they are widely seen as inequitable to researchers from lower income countries, for example, and they introduce friction and delays into the system. So is there some new way that we should think about paying for this infrastructure that is considered valuable? And how should journals continue to provide that curation and contextual work, the summarizing of material in an open access framework? So I'll close just with the thought that COVID has been the first pre-printed epidemic. In the case of the first SARS and Zika, it took a very long time for the research to appear, even after, coming out after the outbreak had essentially finished. That won't be the case for COVID, partly because the outbreak is lasting longer, but because that rise in preprints has been very rapid. And that's, on the one hand, good, and on the other has led to concerns like the one on the left about the waste in COVID research and how we make it more effective. And maybe that's something we can talk about in the discussion. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Theodora.
I'm not sure why my video went off while I was presenting, but it doesn't seem as though I can.
We see your photo.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes left for the discussion, and there is one that came in via the chat, and I'm going to read it to you, to everyone. It's by Eric von Elm, and the question is, authors confirm that they have followed appropriate equator reporting guidelines, many of which published by the BMJ, and uploaded a relevant reporting checklist as supplementary files, but for many preprints on medRxiv, these checklists are not available. Are all these authors ignoring medRxiv standards? And if yes, what is medRxiv doing about it? Thanks.
Yes, they are probably ignoring our standards. And what we do is we try to distinguish between things that can be fixed later. So they say they've got a Prisma checklist, for example, but they haven't posted it. If someone draws attention to it, that can be fixed. On the other hand, if they never got ethical approval for the research, that can't be fixed later. So that we will hold up print. Apologies, I'm getting a message that my microphone is not working.
Well, I can hear you, so
I don't know what.
We can hear you. Everything's okay. Don't worry.
Everything's good. All right. So
working somewhere.
yeah. So in essence, where we know that we have to check before posting, we do so. But if it's something that can be checked later, where the community can say, hey, you said the data were available, where are they? Then we allow that to be posted and the community can ask that question.
Thank you. Any other question? Otherwise, I think we should move on because we are already a little bit late. So thanks again. And Daniel, thank you.
Yeah, also from my side, thank you, Theodora, for this presentation that will also facilitate probably a further discussion later on. And we now come to our third speaker, Christopher Baum. He is the new CEO of the Berlin Institute of Health, new because he started in October, but he is not only CEO of the BIH, he is an internationally renowned expert in translational research itself. While he has focused on gene therapy over many years, he of course has experiences from different health research areas, from oncology and pediatrics. And he would present now on how COVID-19 impacted on translational research, maybe as an acceleration in some areas, maybe also as a threat in other areas. And thank you very much, Christopher, for presenting here.
Okay, Daniel, I hope everybody can hear me. And I would like to share some thoughts regarding the impact of the pandemic on the process of translation. And so we need to define what we are talking about. A famous statement made by Sir Francis Bacon some 4 centuries ago said, knowledge itself is power. However, we know quite well that knowledge or information is not necessarily resulting in action or function. And translation, as we use it here, can be maybe defined as the process of this conversion. This is beautifully illustrated by the use of this term in the field of genetics, where information in the form of mRNA is being converted into proteins by translation. So proteins are, of course, the biological tools of cellular action and function. In the field of medicine, we can perfectly use the existing slogan of the Berlin Institute of Health to address what we mean by translation, turning science hopefully into health. Since its inception, some 10 years ago, the Berlin Institute of Health operates in national and international networks to improve the process of translation in medicine. And conferences such as the World Health Summit or Translate, as seen here on this slide, are highly important on this path. And the first international Translate conference 6 years ago, organized here in Berlin, a consensus statement was formulated by an international group of distinguished scientists who made clear that translation is not simply occurring by pairing clinical with basic researches. And subsequently, the importance of robustness, reproducibility, and validity of translational research findings became more and more apparent, as did the need for fruitful international interactions. On this occasion, I would like to invite you to the next Translate conference, which we will organize in January, presumably in a digital format. Now, translation does happen successfully. Current drug pipelines are not empty. Indeed, over the past years, we see rather an increase, as shown here by the FDA, in drug licensing, which is mostly driven by new developments in the field of cancer with small molecules, antibodies, and other biotherapeutics, and more recently also new products from the field of gene and cell therapy. And the apparent drop here that you may note for 2020 is simply resulting from the fact that data were collected here, I think, in May. So it will be very interesting to see how this looks by the end of this pandemic year. For conventional drug treatment, we are very well aware of the famous bottlenecks that result in a rather inefficient process lasting for, on average, more than 15 years from discovery to application. However, there are also many new classes of products to be considered. And in fact, academia-driven research is the driving force for the field of advanced medicinal products, ATMPs, biomarkers for precision medicine, and also for the discovery of novel anti-infectives and vaccines, which is, of course, highly important to note in the current pandemic. To strengthen these developments, we cannot just use the paradigms of conventional pharma developments. Indeed, biologics and ATMPs are rising stars on today's pharma market. And while promising a rational intervention with an increased chance of cure, they are also much more complex than conventional small molecules and thus need a more interdisciplinary expertise and international expertise for successful development. With this in mind, how can we contribute as an organization, in this case the Berlin Institute of Health, dedicated to the mission of translation? You're all aware of the typical value chain of drug discovery, which is depicted here. And in an international team effort, researchers of the Berlin Institute have made a strong contribution to new recommendations on how to improve target validation in drug research. The acronym GOTIT stands for Guidelines on Target Assessments for Innovative Therapeutics. And the concept simply is to reduce attrition and increase effectiveness of preclinical research by a timely focus on target assessment. And such aspects such as target-related safety issues, druggability, and assayability. These recommendations will be published in depth in Nature Reviews Drug Discovery soon. And they have been designed to support both scientists in academia and in industry to advance their translational projects. Now, for the field of the ATMPs, there is a second challenge later in the preclinical transition phase, typically related to upscaling and manufacturing. And the impact of the current pandemic for these translational approaches is, I think, twofold. First, while national resources might decrease support of activities that are not directly targeting the pandemic, it will be even more important to focus on the robustness of the preclinical data. and save resources by proactive international corporations. Because one thing is clear, we need to avoid what has been addressed as pandemic research exceptionalism. We need to avoid lowering scientific standards in times of the pandemic, because all translational developments in the field of medicine are made for other human beings that expect, of course, the highest level of certainty before being subject to treatments with new forms of medical interventions. Therefore, even when confronted with urgent issues related to the current pandemic, we need to emphasize even more the importance of the regulatory and the patient perspective in our translational agenda. This is not a passive relationship. Early interactions with regulators provide scientists with a clear concept on the necessary and also on the sufficient steps required for clinical application, thus increasing velocity and avoiding waste in preclinical developments. And vice versa, researchers, scientists provide regulators with novel perspectives on the value of preclinical assays and clinical trial endpoints. That is, so it's also in that respect very important to look into the patient perspective for, and by proactive communication, also redesign studies according to patient needs. And next to interacting early with patients and regulators, academic researchers also need to improve their exchange with industry. Indeed, given the increasing complexity and the reduced resources available for translational developments, on-site activities, local activities, need to be combined as early as possible with international networking, thus developing a given translational project to the individual needs of a given project. I'm convinced the more efficient we will be in this global team science approach, and here the national potential partners are just an example, the more we will be able to overcome the risks of developmental delays that we face in the current challenge of the pandemic preoccupation. With this background, you may understand why research at the Berlin Institute of Health also addresses basic factors that contribute to a fruitful translational mindset. Our Quest Center, which has already been introduced by our chairman, offers a whole matrix of activities that are all being developed in international team efforts. I do not have the time to take you through all these various items, and if you're interested, I refer you to our website. Importantly, it's also important to note that the pandemic offers novel opportunities. It's not just a threat to strengthen translational research. And I would like to give you an example illustrating this with the newly formed network of university medical centers in Germany, the NUM, as abbreviated here, supported since April by 150 million euros, as Daniel mentioned before, for the first year of its inception by our National Ministry of Research. It connects basically all the university medical centers of our Federal Republic. On average, we have one center for roughly 2 million people of our population. And this connection and networking is made to increase the efficiency of health management in times of the pandemic and also beyond. Since the first nationwide call for proposals in April this year, 13 joint networks projects have been formed in the NUM based on more than 280 individual proposals originating from all the more than 36 centers. These networks address almost all aspects of pandemic management that you could think of, from procedures for diagnosis and surveillance, over integrated organization of our healthcare system, to issues of palliative care, social and other contextual factors. Within less than 3 months, formerly fragmented systems, such as the German healthcare system, indeed it's quite fragmented, that was dominated by the paradigm of competition between different sites, has been transformed in a team approach to combat the pandemic challenge. Typical for Germany with its federated academic system, steering committees for the various projects are not being centralized at one site, but rather distributed to about half of the participating centers in the country. To achieve national integration, despite this complexity, there is a national task force which was created with contributions of representatives of the responsible two ministries of research and health, of our federal member states, and of the university hospitals. For those of you who do not know details of our healthcare system, you need to know that this is a potential major game changer. National guiding of healthcare at the level of high-end university medical centers has never occurred in this country before. Interestingly, most individual UMCs contribute to at least half of the projects of the NUM, distributed all over the country. And to further illustrate the strong level of participation achieved within this short period of time, the 36 local sites altogether form a bunch of 240 individual projects, well organized in the matrix of the 13 network items. Again, let me emphasize that strong participation is not the result of top-down decisions, but rather of a fair and constructive bottom-up approach involving all sides. So even though we are just at the start of this new network, we can already make a few preliminary conclusions. It is possible to nationally integrate the pre-existing diversity of our medical healthcare system, and thereby also fostering international exchange. Interoperability of the federated partners is one of the important tasks and aims, and this occurs, at least for our country, with unprecedented speed and efficiency. It covers all relevant aspects of the pandemic's management and catalyzes co-working for other tasks in our healthcare system. Patient-centered action fields dominate the design of the various networks, addressing medical and societal needs, and thereby we have a paradigm created for stronger central or federal governance in our, as I said, still fragmented healthcare system, and the leading role of the university medical centers in our future system. So the final point I would like to make is about an important aspect of translation, which is information of the public on knowledge transfer. And here we also have a very strong positive impact of the current pandemic crisis. So we have returned from post-factual argumentation to fact-based discourses. You're all aware at this point, of course, that uncertainty is increasing in our society with every day of an insufficiently controlled health care situation. And therefore, a transfer of scientific knowledge into the society becomes even more important. To illustrate this, I brought this picture of a recent event when our head of virology at Charité, Christian Drosten, was awarded with the highest national recognition by our federal president. Of note, when Drosten was recruited to the Charité a few years ago, nobody could have predicted the factual relevance of his predominant research interest in coronavirus. However, at that time, Charité already was very well aware of the importance of global health. Likewise, the rapid discovery of the 3D structure, just another example, of the major coronavirus protease and the definition of novel targeted drug candidates by Hilgenfeld and his team from my former university in Lübeck, was only possible based on former support of basic science. This underlines the need to continuously support basic science, because some of the major challenges that we will face in the next years remain unpredictable and will need a rapid and still highly rational response. So in summation, all I wanted to say is the following. Academia-driven translation needs to be organized in a global team science approach that is resilient to pandemic threats. Pandemic situation accelerates networking, especially if there is, let's say, supportive grants by federal resources, as I illustrated with the network of university medical care in Germany. And finally, the current crisis illustrates the societal relevance of basic science. Yeah, okay, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Christopher. So far, this was the last presentation. I think we can now already go into the general discussion mode, but obviously we should address questions to the last speaker first, if there are any. So in the, let me just check. Yes. There is a question that just came in. I'm just checking to whom I should address it. Well, I have a problem with it because there's an abbreviation that I don't know what it is, an LIC. Let me, I'm just reading it to
low income.
Sorry. I guess this is then let's just, start the general discussion. There's also one leftover from earlier on. But let me just start with the one that I just started to read, and whoever feels ready to answer it, please step in. So the question comes from Anip Joshi, and it is, what is the strategy to make low-income countries inclusive in COVID-19 research into global mainstream fight against the pandemic? I think that's a very relevant question. Who wants to address this? Christopher.
Yeah, I think I'm not aware whether there's a global strategy there, but it's interesting when we look at the vaccination clinical trials that they don't only take place, of course, in the high-income countries, and they're distributed all over the world. I think it's very important then to have a look whether this is really a fair distribution of the best possible resources into all of the countries. And it's a highly relevant question also for the field of translation. So we have to somehow there has to be maybe also at the level of the WHO a collection of all the different current vaccine trials. I think this is available, and a second look into the question whether the distribution is fair over the various countries.
Thank you. So maybe I can read to you another question that I think relates to the first talk, but it came in later. So probably I would like to address this to Andreas. I'm reading to you now. To what extent have the new SOPs been considered by the current search for SARS-CoV-2 vaccine? How do we ensure that the speedy nature of the SOPs does not affect the quality of research outcomes? I guess also another very pertinent question. I think Andreas should start, and then Daniel, the next.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that very important question. So as you realize, there are thousands of studies ongoing on COVID worldwide. And again, many countries have started to implement special procedures for ethics review. So this question is extremely important indeed. It is hard for me to say, which trials exactly have been affected by these SOPs, because there are just very many. But I think the second part of the question I can answer very well. How to ensure that despite the rapid review, we have still high quality ethics research. And I think it's very important to emphasize again that all the ethics principles have to be upheld. I would say that the ethics review, although it has to be accelerated, in a way has to be even more thorough, because whether it's Ebola or COVID, every time there's such a high, let's say, mediatic event, all the spotlights are on the politicians, on the researchers, research related to COVID has to be absolutely up to the standards. Otherwise, in today's time and day, there would be immediately a backlash, which in a way is good for quality control. And this is why, even in terms of a procedural requirement, it is very important that the ethics review is very thorough, even more so, I would argue, than in normal times. Over.
Thank you very much. Daniel.
Yeah, I think my question addresses both Theodora and Christopher. You both have backgrounds in basic sciences, molecular medicine. At least I know from Christopher that he, of course, has also experiences in the clinical fields, such as oncology and pediatrics. So if I just take two of the things that we discussed, preprint and this new push for cooperation, are there some hints? Are there some predictions that the current developments that we see during COVID-19 might also spread over other fields? Do you have rather positive predictions in this regard, or would you assume it might be something that we will see in a heavy decline if COVID-19 is, let's say, resolved or whatever? Or is there a culture starting now that will affect other non-COVID-19 questions as well?
So I'm an optimist, and I hope that where people have seen improved ways of communicating and improved ways of collaborating through the pandemic, that they will continue to use those in other fields. But I think that institutions and funders have a key role to play there in saying, this is what we expect of our researchers. So maybe I'll then hand that over to Christopher. He can say what he thinks.
Theodora, I was very much impressed by your presentation, and I think you had an element in there that I think is highly important to accelerate the transfer of knowledge into clinical reality, and that is to make use of the preprint mechanism and, of course, the published papers that have been peer-reviewed, and then have a second layer of rapid systematic reviews on top. I think so for principles of evidence-based medicine and maybe accelerating this systematic review format would be the way to go, especially with pre-printed material. So if one could maybe organize expert groups for rapid systematic oversight of what has been published, either preprint or published material, fully published material, fully peer-reviewed material, that I think would find very helpful. And I'm not sure whether there are any efforts to structure this process, but there's a clear need, as you mentioned, for chloroquine and maybe even remdesivir or dexamethasone and JAK kinase inhibitors and whatever we can think of that has been proposed for repurposing in COVID, that we have all the knowledge created by expert teams as meta research available and also updated regularly.
Maybe directly to this point, because I know this from our German context with regard to this university network that Christopher just introduced. But as best as I know, I think something similar is currently happening also in France and probably also in other countries, is that there are these activities here in our national network of university medical centers. One of these 13 projects is, for example, this is a COVID evidence ecosystem. And it even goes one step further. And this is what I meant, I think is also happening in France and other countries. It already includes this step that was highlighted. So work with living reviews, have a very strong network across those who do the living evidence reviews with those who develop clinical practice guidelines, have maybe a continuously updated clinical practice guideline network. But a third aspect, so to say, is to even further increase the ecosystem of evidence in the way that you also capture all the studies that have not been reported, that have not reported their results yet, right? We know that there are, I don't know what, clinicaltrials.gov list about 3,000 to 4,000 clinical studies currently on COVID-19. We know from former pandemics, such as the swine flu pandemic, that about 1/3, maybe even more, of completed clinical studies have not been reported, even up to today. And so the question is, of course, living reviews directly worked into clinical practice guidelines, but also being aware, the whole community needs to be aware how much of the completed studies have not reported results. And again, it's about also funders and academic institutions to support their researchers in making maybe all data available. And preprint, of course, could be a missing link, right? Maybe people would say it in former times, it was so hard to publish results from completed studies that are not bringing the utmost knowledge gain, maybe. But nowadays, maybe again via preprint servers, via summary results reporting and other means, we could increase this. Yeah.
Can I just remind the audience that there is still the possibility to ask questions by sending them in through the Q&A button. And while this may happen, maybe I'm allowed to bring up a question that bugs me, and maybe there's help from someone out there, and that's not been brought up in the discussion so far. And that's, in fact, it has been brought up, and that was Christopher who showed this slide with Drosten, our virologist, getting honored by our president. And that's the dialogue between science and politics. And I think, and policymakers, and that I guess is in the end extremely important to get the science out on the street. And if we look at different countries, it is handled very differently. But I don't see any country, and even not Germany, where this is done the way I would expect this should be done, and that's that this exchange should be inclusive, it should be transparent, it should be robust, and it should be accessible. And if you have these criteria, and if you look what's happening right now, we're just not there. So my question is there a country where we see a process that we could use as a blueprint, or how can we make ourselves ready to have such a dialogue that has these criteria for the next epidemic, which will certainly strike?
So I can't offer a country that is doing it exceptionally well. Unfortunately, I think there are too many bad examples. But one thing that I know a number of people have called for is that researchers should not be willing to advise government behind closed doors. They should only agree to do so on the basis that their advice will be public and transparent. And then, of course, there are political decisions that have to be made that are more complicated than following the science, as the UK government says, because you have to balance livelihoods with lives in intensive care. But we should at least be clear what the scientific evidence is, what the advice is. And that seems to be something that the research community can undertake on its own. And I think maybe Anthony Fauci in the US has really done a great job of that, of saying, no, that's not what we're advising. That's not what we're advising, while sitting next to a president who's contradicting him. So, yeah.
Maybe I would like to add
Muted.
that it requires a high level of courage by the scientists to be so actively and personally involved in the public discussions, because there are these people who are very hostile when it comes to recommendations for lockdown maneuvers, and they then focus their negative emotions on the advisor, the scientist, rather than on politics, or rather than following a typical discourse that would be expected, which would just be a discussion. So it is good that people are recognizable as human beings and individuals to contribute to lobbyism for policymakers, but it's also a challenge to be such a public person then in a situation like the pandemic. And we still have to learn also as a society how to deal with this exposure of scientists, this public exposure.
Thank you. So I hope Andreas allows me to use one of the questions that comes in from the audience to allow participation. And that's a question that comes in from Tracy Weisgerber. I'm pretty sure it's mostly addressed to Theodora. And the question is regarding preprints. What are your thoughts on using automated screening tools to detect problems such as missing checklists, missing information on whether experiments were blinded or randomized, etc.? Individual comments are helpful, but readers can't keep pace with the thousands of COVID preprints being published.
Yeah, so I think there are sort of two stages where automated tools have been looked at. One is at the stage where we as preprint servers are posting something. We're routinely contacted by AI companies who hope to say they can get rid of the human screening element because they can tell you automatically whether the paper has what it needs. Mostly those are not yet ready for prime time, I would say. They're improving all the time, but they're not quite as good as human beings. But then I think what has been really interesting is people who are processing and collating preprints post-publication to say which ones include randomized controlled trial information, how many patients, what drugs were they given, and so on. And those are getting better. They still at the moment involve human beings also, but the tools can help pull out which preprints are of interest to which group. Or if you're interested in children and COVID, it can pull out all of those. So I think those things are all developing, not yet quite there, would be my take.
Since I think we're close to the end of the session, I would like to hand over to Daniel. Maybe you have, you want more questions, or whether you have some closing statements. So I'll hand over to you.
Okay, because we still have 2 minutes, and Andreas had also one point. I don't know whether it's a quick comment, and otherwise we can wrap up.
Actually, it was a quick question to Theodora also, whether she could elaborate a bit more on the sustainability if this is still going on for a year or so.
Yeah, so I think my suspicion is that journals will have to stop giving everything away. The preprint servers, as I said, we have support from Chan Zuckerberg for a 2-year at a reasonable growth rate. So I think we'll be able to carry on. Journals, I'm sure, will start to say somebody somewhere has to pay for the work we're doing, because they're mostly owned by commercial entities who can't continue to be charitable endeavors. But it's very difficult because, of course, funding agencies and others have faced a global economic downturn. So I'm not sure where the answers are going to come from, but I think working out what is of value and paying for it is going to be part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, the word sustainability already is a good word for the wrap up and for the end of our workshop. First of all, I want to thank again our 3 speakers for their input, the online participants for really participating here. And I mean, we heard inputs, and we had some in-depth discussions on, as I outlined at the beginning, really only some topics of these different changes. We saw with regard to this university network, how many different research areas are currently addressed to prepare for pandemic situations like this. And the big question, of course, is what of this will be sustainable, and will we see this not only in preparedness actions for other pandemics, but will some of these positive spins that we saw for improving effectiveness and efficiency in research also spread to other research fields, right? And preprints, of course, collaboration are big topics, but there are many other things that we heard about. So we are to be curious here, and we'll see how this further develops. From my side, thank you very much. I don't know, Uli, if this is also nothing more from you, then thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
All the best.